In this presentation, I'm going to continue the theme of TechCare, but delve in a little more detail into some of the activities that have been part of the TechCare project. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover how we developed a welfare prioritization for small ruminants, which is really one of the first parts of the TechCare process. In Europe, the small ruminants are kept in a variety of different environments. This spans from those animals that are kept housed entirely throughout the production cycle, so they never go outside during the production, and those animals that are housed or managed entirely outside, so are not housed at any point in the year. Also, we have systems where the animals are shepherded, so that means that they are taken outside, but while they are outside, they are continually attended by the shepherd or by a stock person. To add to the diversity of the small ruminants, we also keep them for different production purposes. So they may be managed for meat or for dairy. And these can have different impacts on the sort of welfare issues that these animals might experience. So when we think about the welfare of the small ruminants, their welfare is often perceived by citizens to be good. They are often managed outside and they're very visible when they're outside. They're seen to have much greater behavioural freedom than animals like pigs and poultry, which are often managed inside and kept in quite small, confined areas. And they have frequent social interactions. They're often managed as a group. Their young may be with them for a reasonably long period of time. And they're often perceived to be a natural farming system. So it's seen that their lifestyle when farmed is very similar to that which they might have evolved. So these are seen as very positive things from a welfare point of view. So do these perceptions of high welfare in the small ruminants really match with reality? One of the difficulties of this outdoor extensive management and having behavioural freedoms can mean that there are difficulties in observing the animals, diagnosing and treating disease, and being able to treat animals as individuals when they're managed in a large flock or herd. When animals are managed outside, there is a greater degree of environmental variability. So that can be in terms of the climate. So the animals may be kept in conditions that are very hot and dry or very cold and wet. And there can be seasonal variation in food availability and water supply. And these things are much more difficult to manage in an outdoor system than in an indoor system. Across Europe, many of the small ruminants do transition between an indoor and an outdoor environment, sometimes on a seasonal basis and sometimes on a daily basis. And we know very little about the welfare impacts of this on the animals. So animals that may be very well adapted to an outdoor environment may find an indoor environment much more challenging and are less able to adapt. Because these animals are often perceived to be managed outdoors, there's very little research or understanding about the welfare costs of different housing managements. And in some ways, there's less regulation of housing for small ruminants when indoors compared to other species. And issues around morbidity and mortality are much harder to manage and control outside. So although there's this perception of the natural environment and behavioural freedoms, that doesn't mean that these animals are free from welfare challenge. So the first part of the TechCare project was to develop a welfare prioritisation. So take into account this variation in whether animals are in hot and dry environments, cold and wet environments, whether they're managed indoors or outdoors. And if we want to think about whether PLF approaches can help with the welfare management of small ruminants, then we need to know what aspects of welfare are most important. So what are the most important issues for these animals for the PLF system to be able to manage? And further, we wanted to understand whether these differed by the species, sheep or goats, by the production purpose, so whether they were kept for meat or dairy, and by production systems, so indoors, outdoors, or transitioning between the two. And to understand this, we focused on 3 different groups of animals. So they were meat sheep, dairy sheep, and dairy goats, in terms of understanding what might be the most important welfare issues we should be thinking about. So the way that we conducted our welfare prioritisation was firstly to carry out a literature review that would really cover all mentions of welfare and sheep or goats or small ruminants, and would also consider what might be potential reported welfare issues in the literature at all stages of the production cycle. So that was running right from birth on farm right the way through to slaughter at the abattoir. In addition to our literature review, we also considered the outputs of previous studies that have looked at an expert elicitation exercises to understand expert opinions for sheep welfare. And so there have been a number of these over the last 10 years or so. So by collating these different sources of information, we identified 85 different potential welfare issues for sheep and 60 different issues for goats across the production cycle. However, to understand which were the most important, these are obviously far more issues than we were able to develop and explore as part of this project. We needed to refine this list much more to something that was a bit more workable. So the first part of this process we considered within the TechCare expertise across the different countries. We tried to refine these lists to consider issues that were more relevant to predominantly indoor management or outdoor management. And for sheep as well, we also considered those that were related to the different production purposes. We only focused on one production purpose for goats, which was dairy goats. And this refinement process allowed us to reduce these lists by about a half to a third. So we had about 30 issues that we felt were relevant per species, per country, and per system. And these welfare priorities really covered all the domains of welfare. So we weren't really just focusing on those things that seemed to be most difficult around the climatic variability, but actually we covered a different range of different welfare domains. So for example, some of the issues that were raised dealing with nutrition included things like poor pasture quality, the impact of drought on pasture availability and food quality, whether animals were provided with sufficient feed to meet their metabolic demands, particularly in pregnancy and lactation. And we also considered aspects of the behavioural interactions and access to food through food competition. In terms of the environment, there were particular issues with heat stress, whether when the animals were housed, they were provided with sufficient bedding or sufficient quality bedding, the quality of the air in a housing environment, and some of the issues around the transport of animals to slaughter. It's probably fair to say that many of the issues that were identified in the welfare prioritisation were health issues, but that again covered a range of different things from lameness, mastitis, dystocia, respiratory infection, parasitism, both internal and external, and the possibilities that animals could become injured through the environment. And there were issues around behavioural interactions that animals might experience. So that could be within the animal's environment, so different sorts of behavioural interactions with conspecifics, such as poor maternal relationships, food competition from stocking density, but also the sort of relationships they might have with humans. So particularly in situations where animals aren't handled very often, then fear of humans can become a welfare issue, and that might be exacerbated by the sort of handling that the animal might receive. And because when these animals are managed outside, potentially they also interact with other species, and that particularly the case when those animals interact with wild predators. And where sheep and goats are farmed, that means that across Europe, they often can come into contact with bears, wolves, lynx, and so on, as well as some of the avian predators. So the next step in the welfare prioritisation was to really help us identify welfare issues of relevance to the countries and the stakeholders who might be using our PLF technologies for small ruminant production. And so to do this, we use stakeholder engagement. So as part of this project, and my colleague Eva Sossidou will talk much more about this in her presentation, we set up stakeholder groups within each country, and then they helped us derive a shortened list of relevant welfare issues through their discussions and ranking. And each country involved in the project followed a similar approach to identify the priorities of the welfare priorities that were relevant to their own production systems. And so we have a list of the key welfare priorities by each country. And then we were able to collate those priorities across countries. And that was based particularly on the frequency with which each country prioritized a particular issue and how highly it was ranked within each country in terms of its importance. So to move on to the results, and there will be a number of different outputs that look very similar to these sorts of tables. So this is the prioritization by different countries for meat sheep, and 6 countries in our project provided a ranking for the welfare issues for meat sheep. And for each of these tables, I'm going to show you 3 tables for meat sheep, dairy sheep, and then for dairy goats. And for each sheep, I have ordered these by the most outdoor of each system. So in the UK, for example, we considered the ranking for sheep that lived entirely outdoors and were never housed. And then as we move down the list, the ranking tends to alter as the animals spend more and more time indoors. And so this really demonstrates the variability in these different production systems across Europe, from animals that live entirely outdoors to animals that live mostly or entirely indoors. So you can see in the top half of this table are animals that lived either entirely outdoors or mostly outdoors. Or we have these mixed systems in Norway where the animals may spend almost 6 months of the year outdoors all the time and 6 months of the year where they're indoors all the time. But for those animals that were largely outdoors, you can see very similar issues were prioritized in these different countries. So there was a lot of concern about the ability of the animal to acquire sufficient nutrition from the environment. So either undernutrition or malnutrition, or where the nutrients available were not able to meet the animal's requirements. There were also a number of health issues, in particular lameness and parasitism were of particular concern for animals managed largely outdoors. And then there were concerns around the morbidity and mortality rate and a poor maternal relationship. As we move down the table, you can see that there's more concerns as the animal spends more time indoors. There's greater concern about the quality of the housing environment, the stocking density, competition between animals to be able to access feed, which is obviously related to the stocking density, and things like air quality, which can lead to increase in respiratory disease. 6 countries also considered the dairy sheep issues, and again they are ranked from animals that are mostly live outdoors to animals, as we move down the table, that are mostly indoors, with all sorts of different variations and often regional differences in how much indoor and outdoor time animals experienced. Again, where animals are mostly outdoors, there are disease issues around parasitism, lameness and mastitis that become important, but also, again, issues around the ability of the animal to receive sufficient nutrition from the outdoor environment. Mastitis was an issue that was relevant to dairy sheep in almost any environment, but as we move towards a more indoor environment, the issues surrounding housing conditions and the quality of bedding became more important as a concern for dairy sheep. And for dairy goats, the prioritization was carried out by 3 different countries, and these environments were again had a reasonable indoor component, but may also be mixed about whether the animal spends time indoors and outdoors. And here you can see that mastitis was always ranked in the top 3 for dairy goats. And then there was a range of other issues, other health concerns around parasitism, concerns about the environment in terms of the housing and bedding, and concerns about behavioural interactions, so agonistic social behaviour between and fighting and food competition between different individuals. So just to provide a sort of overview or a summary of what we found by looking at different countries, On the whole, the welfare issues were generally more influenced by production system, so that was largely the amount of time the animal spent either indoors or outdoors, rather than production purpose, and that was particularly the case for sheep, where we had both dairy and meat sheep. So there wasn't as much concern about, there weren't sort of a differentiation by what the animals were kept for, but more related to the way that the animals were housed and managed. There were some similarities between welfare issues for sheep and goats, but they were not completely the same, so the lists weren't exactly the same. So there was a variation in the ranking of particular issues for sheep and goats. And so we use this information to provide a final summarized list of welfare issues by species and production system that would then allow us to consider how we want to focus our thinking by moving the project forwards in terms of what sorts of technologies would be used, what sort of systems or requirements would we need for a welfare management system. So if we summarize the sheep priorities, and what you can see on the left is the priorities for those sheep systems, those countries where the animals were managed entirely or mostly outdoors. And on the left, the rank order of issues for those sheep systems where the animals were managed mostly or entirely indoors. There are some issues that were tied, and you can see that with the equals sign here. So for animals that were mostly outdoors, 4 out of 5 of the issues were disease related. So parasitism, lameness, mastitis, and so internal and external parasites, and physical issues like the provision of sufficient nutrition to meet the animal's needs. But there were some issues again around behavioural interactions, particularly the quality of the maternal relationship and the impact that may have on morbidity and mortality rates for outdoor managed sheep. And again, this sort of reflects the difficulty in providing individualised care and particularly health treatments and diagnoses for animals managed largely outdoors. For animals that were managed mostly indoors, nutrition and disease of mastitis were obviously ranked very near the top, but you can see there's considerable numbers of other concerns around the housing conditions, the stocking density, the quality of the bedding, air quality, and respiratory disease, which is often a feature of poor air quality. So for those animals that were mostly indoors, there was a number of issues which reflect the housing environment and its inability to potentially meet the needs of sheep, rather than as many issues concerned with disease. We also then looked at the overall priorities by species, and again just to provide a comparison between sheep and goats in terms of the individual rankings. And again you can see that the sheep list is predominated by disease issues of mastitis, lameness and parasitism, as well as some issues with ability to provide adequate nutrition and a water supply. Whereas the goat issues, although mastitis was considered the top issue and lameness and parasitism still appear in the list, there's an increase in the in behavioural issues such as agonistic behaviour, food competition, aggressive behaviour between individuals, and the quality of the environmental management also appeared on this list for goats. So again, there seems to be some similarities, but some differences in how the stakeholders prioritise the issues for the different species. So really just to conclude what we found in this work and some of the next steps for the project. So what this piece of work did allowed us to identify the key welfare issues that if we were to produce a PLF system that could provide welfare management for small ruminants, these are the key welfare issues that we would aim to take into account. So although we saw that health and nutritional issues predominated in both species, regardless of the environment in which these animals were kept or the production purpose, so those were things that were seen to be really important in our management of small ruminants. But there were also behavioural issues and environmental issues that were also considered important in some parts of the system or for different species, and this was particularly the case in goat welfare management. So it's important in the next steps of the project and how we design the next steps is to link these welfare issues to the PLF technologies that can enable these issues to be measured. And that's what a colleague Elia will speak about in his next presentation. And to allow us to assess how well these PLF technologies are providing with information that relate to these different issues and that can allow the management of these different welfare issues, we also need to be able to identify relevant animal-based measures and what we might consider to be the gold standard indicators that will allow us to assess the performance of the technology or the algorithms that will be derived and how well they're able to manage the welfare of these animals. And Michelle, in her presentation later in this afternoon, will also talk about some of the work that she's involved in that's helped us to identify, or is starting to help us identify some of the measures that we might want to make in terms of assessing the performance of these indicators. So I'd just like to acknowledge the input of all the TechCare projects partners and to thank you for your attention. Thank you.